to introduce from the German Historical Institute, London, my now colleague, Pascal Siegrist, or Dr. Pascal Siegrist. And I'm actually really happy to say that I think we're the first ones in London to have secured her for a paper. So this is also kind of her debut, which is really exciting, I think. Pascale did her PhD at the University of Constance, and then she went to Florence as a Max Weber Fellow, and from there to Princeton. And she's now at the German Historical Institute working on a new project on the history of language invention projects in Britain and the English-speaking world in the 20th century. But today she will give us an insight into her previous project, which she's still working on, and I think she's going to turn into a book. And also, I think, has just published an article in Global Intellectual History about, so if you're interested, also have a look at that. And this project was a reassessment of 19th century anarchist thought, looking at it from a more global perspective, treating it as a global phenomenon, both in the sense of transnational context, so the way these ideas spread, and its universal ambitions. And her paper today is entitled "The Center Everywhere, Fin-de-Siècle, Anarchist Thought and the End of Global Space." So over to Pascale.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me start by sharing my slides. Okay, yeah, well, first of all, let me start with a round of thanks to my new GHIL colleague, Emily, for this very kind introduction, to Jack, who unfortunately can't be here today, and to the other organizers of the seminar for inviting me, as well as to all of you for attending, obviously. I hope that I'll soon be able to physically join the sessions of this wonderful seminar, but for today, I'm very excited to be here and talk about an aspect of the book project that I'm currently in the process of writing up. Now, what I would like to do in this talk is to offer an alternative genealogy of writing global history and of thinking globally, more broadly speaking. The trend of thinking about the history of globalization in the past 2 decades is often seen in connection with much older modes of thinking the world as a whole, especially with the tradition of writing universal or world history. Now, this is not to suggest that global history is framed as a continuation of the universal histories of old. Quite to the contrary, the philosophical premises of universalism, its inevitable Eurocentrism, its abstract and ungrounded point of view, and its sweeping teleologies are precisely what is seen as objectionable. They are indeed presented as the major mark of distinction between old and new world history. In today's paper, I want to suggest that already in the 19th century, we can find attempts at writing global history that are not per se macro in perspective. I want to argue that this kind of intellectualization of global interdependencies did not so much originate from the discipline of academic history, but from the field of geography, and more specifically, from a socially or anthropologically invested type of geography. Moreover, I would like to put forth that this tradition was especially prevalent among intellectuals whose political affiliations were with anarchism. My paper is thus at the same time intended as a provocation aimed at standard accounts of anarchist thought, which tend to stress its peripheral and parochial nature. While more recent histories of the anarchist movement have helped to shed light on the worldwide career of anarchism, and I'm thinking here, for example, of the work of Benedict Anderson, as well as more specialist studies by Constance Bantman, Lucien van der Walt, or Ilham Khoury-Makdisi. In terms of the intellectual history of anarchism, these insights have not yet really caught on. And this risks producing a vision in which anarchism is a purely European export to the colonized world. And even if that were actually the case, it offers little explanation for the extraordinary success of anarchism outside of Western Europe and the US, where its breakthrough as one of the leading social movements was far above and much earlier compared with, for example, that of Marxist socialism. Yet at the same time, to understand anarchism, as Peter Kropotkin, one of its main proponents, suggested, as a world concept, goes against the grain of historical as well as contemporary assumptions of what anarchism is all about. Reading 19th century anarchists as global thinkers draws attention to their engagement with ideas such as cosmopolitanism and issues like globalization, which are often controversially debated in today's anarchist circles. Rather than treating them as locally myopic grassroots activists, I understand anarchists as holistic thinkers having a global vision. And in my book project, I look at different moments that can be deemed instances of the global thought of anarchists, touching upon issues like their treatment of empire, commerce, global inequalities, race, geopolitics, science, progress, civilization, and modernity. And this hopefully will allow me to demonstrate the importance that anarchists attach to this idea of raising a global consciousness that will become the basis of their political action. But as I was explicitly asked to present the chapter rather than a general overview of the project, for the purposes of this paper, I will focus on the anarchist notion of history. Despite originally concentrating on geography and space, I increasingly came to see history as key, as it allowed anarchists to project the coming of anarchy as an endpoint of a narrative of progress. To understand anarchism as global finally also means to interpret it as being radically modern. Anarchists are often presented as backward-looking nostalgics who want to retreat to a romanticized version of idyllic primitivism. The fact that anarchism emerges towards the end of the 19th century at a crucial moment when globalization really takes off is often taken as evidence for anarchism as a reaction to and rejection of modernity. I, on the contrary, want to argue that anarchists fully endorsed the notion of global modernity and saw themselves as spearheading the march towards it. The case of anarchists also helps us to throw into relief some of the difficulties of the project of writing global history, freed from universalism's homogenizing tendencies. As much as their anthropological lens came with a commitment to particularity and difference, the further the anarchists pushed their globalizing agenda, the more they came up against precisely those same specters that global historians are still wrestling with. The view from nowhere that the cover page of Élisée Reclus' 1905 L'Homme et la Terre suggests was indeed difficult to achieve. This world, with its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere, as this main protagonist of today's talk phrased it, remained in large parts an ideal. I will walk you through the main argument of the chapter in 3 sections. In a first part, I will talk about how the anarchist geographers that I focus on in the project thought about the relationship between time and space, and I will give special attention to the concept of the milieu and how this notion served to substantiate the idea of historical progress as a gradual move away from the dependence on environmental conditions. This leads me to a second point concerning determinism, and I believe it's here where we can most clearly see the political implications of these debates around history. In a final section, I will then come back to the idea of transgressing space and outline the anarchist vision of a global future understood as a history of territorial integration. To start things off, let me fill you in with a bit of background about the already mentioned Reclus. An exiled communard, he settled in the Swiss village of Clarence, here pictured by his wife, in the canton of Vaud for most of the 1870s and 80s. Not only did the proximity to the activists of the Jura Federation push his political thought further in an explicitly anarchist direction, these years also proved to be fruitful for his scholarly work, as Clarence was where he wrote most of his Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, a 19-volume universal geography comprising a staggering almost 20,000 pages published with Hachette. As recent work by Federico Ferretti and Philippe Pelletier has shown, this was of course not the single-handed effort of one man, but Reclus stood at the center of a network with both geographical and anarchist leanings, whose members all contributed to this massive geographical compilation. Many of his closest collaborators, for example, the here listed Mechnikov, Kropotkin, Dragomanov, his brother Elie, and his cartographer Charles Perron, at least for some time, also lived on the shores of Lake Geneva, and with yet more people, he had lengthy correspondences. Most of the members of this circle were also either Russian or had very strong ties to Russia. And I'd be very happy to give some leads as to why and why that matters in the Q&A, but I can't really delve in here. And arguably it was only through such biographical network analysis that the idea of a connection between anarchy and geography came to the attention of scholars in the first place. For it's far from explicit in their writings, and especially in those aimed at a scholarly audience. What we do see in Reclus, however, is a gradual shift of the author's interest from physical geography towards what would now be called human geography. Other than the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, Reclus in fact wrote 2 more multi-volume geographical works, and I think the evolution of the titles already illustrates this general tendency. We go from a first major work simply titled La Terre, the Earth, to La Terre et les Hommes, towards man in the first position in his posthumous work, L'Homme et la Terre, the cover of which I showed you at the beginning of this talk. And along with this evolution, one concept in particular gains prominence, that of the milieu. In La Terre, the term is absent from the first 3/4 of the work, and it only comes up in the final chapters that deal with life and especially with human societies. In the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle already, the influence of the milieu becomes one of the general considerations outlined at the beginning. By the end of his life, the concept is ubiquitous in his writings. By this point, it had become crucial enough to devote an entire chapter of L'Homme et la Terre to the foundation of a mésologie, a science of the milieu. The term was originally Comte's, but as Philippe Pelletier has shown, Reclus' usage of it was inspired more by the physician, demographer, and anthropologist Louis-Adolphe Bertillon. And this goes to show that Reclus' notion of the milieu was closely tied to the interaction between humans and the environment. Indeed, we can observe a parallel tendency of Reclus describing his work with increasing confidence as both géographie sociale and géographie historique. And this also reflects how the work was read at the time. Jean Brunès, a pivotal figure in French geography at the turn of the century, claimed that his colleague's work contains interesting geographical views, but is above all history and sociology. But finally, perhaps nothing illustrates this turn to history better than the fact that Reclus chose as an epigraph to L'Homme et la Terre the Kantian aphorism, "Geography is nothing else but history within space, the same as history is geography in time." Now, what does it mean to read Reclus as a historical thinker and the milieu as a historical concept? The different ways in which Reclus' geography can be thought of as historical is best illustrated with the different types of historical maps that he features in L'Homme et la Terre. We, on the one hand, find examples of the historical evolution of places. For example, this map showing Roman, medieval, and contemporary Zurich. On the other hand, we find maps that render past conceptions and perceptions of the world, such as this reproduction of Maiolo's 1527 map, which supposed the presence of a strait, a strato dubitoso, as it says on the map, in Central America. In very rare instances, we even get a comparison between a modern and historical or local map, such as these images of a Greenland coastline on the left by a native cartographer whom Reclus calls the Eskimo Calbuera, and on the right by a Western cartographer. That space is in this sense relative to perception, as well as dynamic and subject to historical change, is one of the fundamental assumptions about the milieu. Reclus, in fact, distinguishes between the milieu as space and the milieu as time, and introduces a hierarchy between the two that we can assume is both chronological and qualitative. He explains, to the milieu space, characterized by the thousands of exterior phenomena, we have to add the milieu time with its incessant transformations, its endless repercussions. History begins, first of all, by being all geography, as Michelet says. Geography gradually becomes history by the continued reaction of man on man. And the reference to Michelet is telling here, but he is only one of the classics of 19th century historicism that Reclus cites. His historical references are quite international and also include Leopold von Ranke and Sergei Solovyov. With Michelet, there is even a complicated personal relationship, as Michelet's former son-in-law in a second marriage married Reclus' sister. So the quote here, which in full reads, "The true starting point of her history has to be the political division of France, shaped after her natural and physical division. At first, history is all geography." And it's taken from Michelet's famous Tableau of France, in which spatial unities, the regions, supply the foundation for his narrative of the making of France. So it's crucial that Reclus takes up this idea of history emerging from locality, but gradually transgressing it, this already mentioned movement from space to time. In an original state, the influence of the environmental conditions is taken to be overwhelming, and Reclus here uses a very strong language, speaking, for example, of the anthropoplastic properties of the milieu, or again, calling race the daughter of the earth. And I really think that this illustration here for the Milieu chapter pretty much says it all, and I hardly need to do a lot of unpacking here. But he also acknowledges the human capacity of acting upon the milieu and gradually transforming the surroundings. This movement from passive dependence to active appropriation of the earth is indeed what the study of historical geography is all about. As he himself specifies, if geography proper, that only occupies itself with the form and relief of the planet, expands the passive state of peoples in their history of old, historical and statistical geography, on the other hand, shows us men having entered into their active role and reaching new heights through work on the milieu that surrounds them. In a very early article, he describes this growth in intelligence and freedom as emerging from the power to associate, a power that allows humans to modify the earth, to change water courses, to transform the climate of entire continents. United, they become, as he calls it, genuine geological agents. The role conceded to association in this means that the milieu is understood as a relational concept. The unity and cohesion of a given space is assured by its interconnections, and this also means that spatial categories are hardly static, but can evolve over times. The Alps had once been a formidable barrier, but as this map shows, the construction of passes has turned them into a zone of encounter. The Mediterranean, thanks to the introduction of telegraph cables and steamship connections, is now one integrated whole. And the role conceded to the human shaping of the environment also means that a given environment can have vastly different effects on different populations. In a very early Revue des Deux Mondes article written shortly after his return from America, Reclus argues that the Mississippi only became viable with the arrival of settler colonists. As I quote, "The Indians living exclusively from hunting did not have to solve the problem of having to associate in order to regulate the flow of the river and the irrigation channels of the riverside fields." For Reclus, such differences in the usage of the land signal two things. First, that gaining control over the resources of the milieu did not put an end to human dependence on nature, but on the contrary, only rendered more complex and categorical the interaction between man and the earth, insofar as 1,000 things that used to be useless to him have now become necessary to him. Secondly, it suggests that there was no internal prescription of a historical course to be followed, no teleology inscribed into the milieu. But we can see that he's well aware of being read in such a way, so he's very careful to insist the milieu does not exert as such a fatal influence and always the same one. It's not in the milieu itself that we have to look for the raison d'être of the institution and civilizations of a people, but in the relation of accommodation that this people present with the phenomena of the natural surroundings. Yet the problem of environmental determinism remained a sticky one for authors whose politics inclined them towards action. And this is where we arrive at my second point. Okay, I was a bit too early with the slides there because we have to talk a bit about determinism first. So one of the few scholars to take Reclus seriously as a historical writer, Lucien Febvre, places him in an intermediary position in a rather sharp distinction that he draws between geographical determinism on the one hand and possibilism on the other. While determinism here emanates from a German tradition following Friedrich Ratzel, possibilism is tied to a French school as institutionalized by Paul Vidal-Lablache. In this opposition, Reclus emerges as a thinker integrating but overcoming Germanic determinism as both a mediator and innovator of French geography. There are many arguments in favor of such reading, especially Reclus' German training with the Moravian brothers as a child and as a student under Karl Ritter in Berlin. But there are also some issues with it. For example, that Ratzel of all people, while himself admired by Reclus, accuses his French counterpart of having precisely a deterministic outlook. More importantly, it does not in itself explain why the anarchists were so concerned with the issue. To shed more light on this, I propose turning to the case of my favorite anarchist geographer, Reclus' personal secretary, Lev Metchnikov, and now the slides match up again. Metchnikov, just very briefly, trained as a philologist in Russia, then joined Garibaldi's Milieu as a revolutionary, spent several years as a teacher in Japan, hence pictured here in kimono, and ended up a professor of geography in Switzerland. Like Reclus, he took a keen interest in the geographical conditionality of historical progress, but unlike Reclus, he was very open about how this informed an explicitly anarchist vision of progress. The fundamental problem of history, as Metchnikov understood it, was to explain why free association or anarchy, which he saw as the objectively superior form of social organization, had so little prevalence, why it was that all over the world and throughout history, people lived under despotic regimes. He framed the problem in very dramatic and very 19th century terms as the riddle posed by the Sphinx crouching on the threshold of the ages. And for Metchnikov, not one of the Oedipuses of modern sociology had been able to answer the question why it is that history begins with all but anarchic and voluntary groupings, manifestly the most perfect, but ends in domination. Relating anarchy to prehistory more problematically for Metchnikov, the rare instances where a genuinely free form of association had established itself were normally among people that he regarded as primitive and as lacking an advanced civilization. The Kabyle people of Algeria were a case in point, and interestingly, both Reclus and Kropotkin also referred to the Kabyles as examples of anarchist organization. Metchnikov held that to come back to the anarchy of the Kabyle people of Jejura, that people that hardly counts amongst the half-civilized enjoy, one couldn't deny it, a much superior social constitution from the point of view of sociology than that with most of its French conquerors content themselves. And yet nobody would think of contesting the latter the honor of occupying one of the first ranks among the civilized nations of the globe. Metchnikov sought to resolve the tension between freedom and civilization by breaking up the social bond in both qualitative and quantitative terms. In an article outlining his conception of a science of society, he identified association as the underlying law of such a science and introduced a hierarchy between mechanical, coerced, and voluntary cooperation. In short, the more conscious the nature of the association and the higher the degree to which it was freely conceded, the better its quality. When it came to assessing the amount or quantity of these different types of cooperation, he again turned to geohistory. In his grand civilizational theory, La civilisation et les grands fleuves historiques, published posthumously in 1889 by no other than Reclus, Metchnikov mapped out a theory of historical progress as conditioned by the Earth's bodies of water. History for him meant the prodigious growth of man's power over the brute forces of nature, over space and time, his two cosmic foes. Taking the conquest of space and time as the basis for his theory of the march of civilization, he could combine a linear progression with local variation and the possibility of regression. He distinguished between 3 main phases, each of which corresponded to a particular geographical setting and a mode of social or indeed political organization. First, a Potamic or fluvial period, during which civilizations arose along the great historic rivers like the Nile or the Ganges. This was the era marked by despotism. It corresponded to the age of imposed association. Only a despotic power supported by religion could summon the amount of cooperation necessary for the vast irrigation projects, albeit only through the enslavement of the population. This was then superseded by a second Thalassic or Mediterranean period that stood for feudalism and the age of subordinated association. Oligarchic lords now ruled over populations that were nominally free, but for economic constraints had little choice but to concede their labor. The improvement in the quality of association did not concern the internal organization alone. The shift from fluvial to Mediterranean civilization also manifested itself in a passage from separate, isolated civilizations to increasingly connected ones. This development finally culminated in a third oceanic period, the beginning of which had been marked by the great discoveries and the opening of the Atlantic. The Mediterranean period had been essentially European, but this was about to change. As the gold rush pushed civilizations towards California and the Russian Empire began to expand eastwards toward the Pacific, it was about to become a truly universal age. In terms of its social and political organization, it was the age of universal civilizations, also in the sense of universalist values. The third corresponding sociological stage of coordinated association had as its principles liberté, égalité, fraternité. Crucially, this stage model made it possible to portray the age to come not only as global, but also as anarchist. Anarchy became at once the primitive as well as the potential final stage in the course of civilization. And now Metchnikoff was wildly optimistic about the course of history. But if history follows its normal course, an equilibrium increasingly establishes itself between the milieu and the anarchic aptitudes of its occupants. Little by little, progress manifests itself, by which we mean the transformation of the social bond, which rises from coercion to anarchy, from imposed solidarity to volitional solidarity. Increasingly freed from the dependence on physical conditions that had made the emergence of great civilizational achievements possible, humanity would go on to perfect its innate quest for freedom. Environmental determinism would be overcome. Not everybody agreed. In fact, Metchnikoff's book was quite badly received at the time. For reasons of time, I will only touch upon one of its critiques, Georgy Plekhanov. What is interesting here is that Plekhanov agreed with most of Metchnikoff's scientific premises, but saw them as corrupted by his political agenda. As he himself put it, the anarchist considerations quite seriously damaged the merit of Lev Ilyich Metchnikoff's book. They damaged it insofar as they prevented a systematic development of the absolutely true and fruitful thoughts that are at the basis of it. Now, there is one line of commentators who have tried to put forth a reading according to which, in the 19th century, anarchists were interested in space and thus invested in the local and particular, and Marxists were interested in time and therefore universalists. This is another point which I'm happy to discuss further at the end of this talk, but Plekhanov is an interesting outlier in the Marxist tradition in that he was immensely interested in space. While he subscribed to the Marxist conception of history as moving along distinct stages, the sort of standard account from feudalism to capitalism to communism, he looked precisely to geography to account for Russia's backwardness. He argued that the open plains of Eurasia acted as a valve, absorbing the class conflicts that would allow history to move forward. This environmental argument made it possible to include Russia's unusual path into the universal laws of historical progress. But it also led him to the exasperating conclusion that the prospect of revolution was still a very long way ahead for Russia. And here the difference with anarchists becomes really apparent. Also commenting on Russia in the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, Reclus, to the contrary, suggests that the skipping of predetermined historical stages was a very real possibility. History could speed up. Noting how train tracks began to replace dirt roads, Reclus observed, Russia has thus entered the modern industrial era before having produced the previous stages. Her movements will be faster, history will rush for her. So we can see here that humans not only acted upon the environment, but in so doing, they acted upon history. As revolutionaries, anarchists remained committed to a worldview in which agency remained fundamental to change. And just to briefly illustrate this, at the same time as to finally come to the third white man with a beard that my study looks at, let's have a quick look at a letter by Kropotkin. Well, Kropotkin is certainly the best known of the thinkers that appear in this talk. His trainings and publications on geography, such as his early studies of Siberian orography, are much less well known. His fame is as the conscious and, if you will, the leading authority in the anarchist movement. And it is in this role that he responds to Domela Nieuwenhuis, a Dutch anarchist who had written to him about his feelings of hopelessness for the anarchist cause in times of reaction. Ever the scientist, Kropotkin replied with a graph. History gave reasons to be optimistic, he held. Tracing the course of the French Revolution, the continuous line that we can see here represents progress as it actually happened. And Kropotkin attributes this peak that we can see in 1793 to the action of the anarchists, the enragés, and their campaigns. Kropotkin also adds a dotted line, I don't know if you can see it here, that illustrates what history would have looked like without the surge of anarchist activism after 1790. Reaction would have been immediate, and the level of 3 years later would never have been reached. Even if the actual backlash goes far below, by 1830, the continuous curve has again overtaken the dotted one. So revolutionary conquests were never entirely reversible, but brought real overall progress. So where does that leave us? We have seen in Reclus that there is a movement from geography towards history, and that in Mechnikov, such a movement was one from individual civilizations towards a global age. For all three, including Kropotkin, this was understood as progress also in a political sense. Indeed, progress could hardly take place in isolation. In L'Homme et la Terre, Reclus noted, today all the peoples are entering into the dance. There can be no more question of progress, but for the entire world. His assessment of his times shows that he clearly felt that he was witnessing momentous changes that translated into a shift in historical consciousness. History was becoming universal. What I want to suggest in the final section of this talk is that once the movement of history was applied to geography, the path suggested was indeed one of integration or of globalization, including its implication of homogenization. And this last point is perhaps the most contentious one from an anarchist perspective. There is, of course, in the work of anarchist geographers, a minute depiction of the wealth of different cultures and civilizations all over the globe. As I've so far only hinted at this, it should be stressed again that historical regress is always seen as a possibility. In his comments on Vicos, Corsi and Ricorsi, for example, Reclus seems to suggest a spiral model in which a return is never quite the same, but a step up in the ladder of progress. Similarly, we find allusions to familiar cross-regional tropes, such as the idea of a spatial progression of civilization, of a sort of continuous wandering of its hearth from east to west. There are maps of the movement of civilization, such as this one, showing their place of origin, their expansion, move, and extinction. But Reclus argues that such models have but a temporary and local value. we sense that a profound shift is taking place in an age when the different parts of the world are increasingly connected, when time and space begin to shrink. Reclus thus asks, but has it not become evident to the members of the great human family that the center of civilization is already everywhere, in accordance with the thousand discoveries and applications that are being made each day, here and there, and that immediately are propagated from city to city on the Earth's sphere? This main direction of modern civilization is thus no longer seen as a progression from place to place, but as a movement towards increasing unity. It is very obvious from Reclus' work that he takes geographical unity to be a decisive advantage. This is the case for individual milieu, nations, continents. One of the reasons for what Reclus perceived to be the backwardness of Africa, Asia, and America as opposed to Europe was precisely their alleged lack of such unity. It also applied to the Earth as a whole, which was only beginning to accomplish its definitive unification. This was globalization, both material and intellectual. In a political pamphlet this time, rather than in a geographical work, Reclus wrote that Columbus and Magellan were the first to establish the material unity of the Earth, and since this period, many philosophers and revolutionaries could foresee its future moral unity. In Reclus' eyes, modern society was only on the cusp of reaching this globalization of the minds. For him, it embraces the world, but it has not yet grasped it. And in a later chapter of the book, I will unpack in more detail what such global consciousness could look like for the anarchists and how they were hoping to promote such sentiment of belonging to humanity as a whole. In what remains, I want to insist on just how far these implications of global unity went. Reclus predicted the coming of a universal language and was thrilled at the promise of the intermixing of races leading to the eventual eradication of their differences. Overall, the prospect of a globalized modern world was an optimistic one for the anarchists, even if they realized that it came at a cost. When Reclus exclaimed, "How many small distinct humanities have perished before the great humanity was born?" this was less a sign of his regret about the loss of past civilization than a recognition of their individual contribution to this higher universal form of civilization. Modern man was called upon to retain or even reconquer what was lost of the attributes of past civilizations. Reclus frankly admitted that the primitives or ancients could exceed modern man in strength, health, and beauty, but simply argued, well then, we must become their equals again. Taking the best characteristics of each era and from each region of the Earth also gave modern global civilization a more resilient character. Unlike the ancient civilizations, it was immune to decadence and ruin because it brought together the advances of each individual civilization that composed it in solidarity. Each people would continue the progress of others. If Metchnikoff doubted that the burden was equally shared between the people of history and the people of nature, both agreed that civilization was becoming the common work of the whole of humanity. Civilization here increasingly being used in the singular. Reclus recognized that the assimilation of all these heterogeneous elements on the one hand led to higher complexity, but also pointed out that on the other hand, this vast society tends to simplify itself. Precisely this homogenizing tendency has been at the heart of much of the contemporary criticism from the anti-globalization movement. And I mean, there would be many examples, but David Harvey, for example, has offered a reading in which the flattening tendency of universalisms clash with the geographer's sensibility for difference. And 19th century anarchists were much more positive in their evaluation of modernity as a process of global unification. And this is mainly due to the fact that they did not regard the European origins of such tendencies as a problem. For Metchnikoff, universalization rather bluntly meant the cultural Europeanization of the rest of the world. La Civilisation and its maps of European penetration made this more than explicit. There can be little doubt here that local particularisms would have to be sacrificed to universalism. He held that what seems to me to characterize our century above all is the more and more marked tendency of European civilization to universalize itself, to penetrate into the least accessible recesses of the earth, to face all local color, to suppress all the differences. So I think that's a really strong language here. And more or less the same holds true for Reclus in an article with the telling title, The Hegemony of Europe of 1894. Said hegemony was not portrayed as a bad thing. Reclus presents the equalization brought forth by Europeanization as a source of advancement and liberation. He repeats that universalization will prove to be the safeguard of this modern civilization. And this is an argument that he explicitly aims at proponents of sort of cyclical theories who foresaw Europe's fall into decadence. And in the piece, Reclus specified that European civilization, as it expanded, would eventually become detached from its geographical origin. And this is the exact citation here. Thus, from progress to progress, European civilization has arrived at the negation of its starting point. She aimed at domination, at preponderance, and by her conquests themselves establishes equality. The entire world is becoming European, or one could even say that it has become European already. And this passage is, in my view, absolutely crucial, for it illustrates that Reclus sort of tries to escape the Eurocentrism trap by removing hierarchy both in a geographical and in a historical sense. Sort of, he's trying to say here that imposition may have been the case at the beginning, but now we have unity and equality, and it doesn't matter where we are anymore. And I think that this would hardly be satisfying for modern commentators. And in the final instance, this de-Europeanization, this negation of the starting point, implied that locality more generally ceased to function as a meaningful category. A passage from L'Homme et la Terre helps to underline this suggestion, where Reclus argues that, I quote, the spatial element has lost its importance because man can educate himself and does actually educate himself about all the phenomena of the earth. So in a way, knowledge of geography at the same time makes geography redundant. Now, if abandonment of space is the final conclusion of an anarchist geography, its implications would be quite far-reaching also in political terms. And indeed, when we look at Kropotkin's description of the federal communal structures of the future, we find a very similar notion of sort of going beyond territory. In an essay commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Commune, its legacy is understood to have become universal, as the spatial limitations of communal structures of old will be overcome. He writes, for us, commune no longer means a territorial agglomeration. It is a rather generic name, a synonym for the grouping of equals, which knows neither frontiers nor walls. Each individual will find the full satisfaction of his needs only by grouping with other individuals who have the same tastes, but inhabit 100 other communities. So people connecting all over the world. And this ideal of free association, ultimately transgressing any dependence on territoriality, also in a way appears in his definition of progress as he frames it in his Encyclopedia Britannica article on anarchism, where progress is described as true progress lies in the direction of decentralization, both territorial and functional. But the stress on decentralization also makes clear that the impetus of the local and personal initiative doesn't just disappear. And it simply can't happen in isolation, as progress also has to be connected to a larger course of history. It was no question of abandoning what was happening on the ground, but of inverting the direction of the flow as to replace what he called the present hierarchy from the center to the periphery. And this goes to show that a reading of Anarchist as merely focused on the local in particular would fail to do justice to the interrelation between both levels that Reclus and Kropotkin postulated. Taken together, such a conception of historical progress amounted to no less than a complete reshuffling of all spatial hierarchies between different parts of the world, between the local and the global, between the center and the periphery, until the day when the center will be truly everywhere. Now, to conclude, let's have a quick look, and I promise this is the end, at the islanders of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, the remotest part of the world. Reclus observed that its inhabitants faced no material wants or shortage of food. They possess what the workers of Europe claim in vain, and yet every year they appeal to the British government to be taken from their corner of the earth and brought to a new homeland. Reclus tried to explain this by conjecturing that around them, the material space is too vast and moral solidarity is lacking. Knowing that humanity exists, they want to feel its influence and solicitude. And this desire to be merged into a universal notion of humanity, and if necessary, even through the intermediary of an empire, we might add, points to this globalizing type of thinking, which I've tried to map out for you today. So I showed that the milieu described the connected space that was defined through these very relations. And as these relations expanded over larger spaces, the specific geographical properties that had so fundamentally shaped the life of early societies gradually lost in importance. History became increasingly independent. As I've then argued, this went hand in hand with the characteristically anarchist focus on agency. Progress required the active collaboration of revolutionaries. And this finally also means that globalization was treated as a process that was not inevitable or exterior to human society, but one that needed to be seized and taken control of. The anarchists of the 19th century thereby sought to actively insert themselves into this process, and this is perhaps where we have the clearest contrast with how globalization is framed in the contemporary debate. And I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pascal. Oh yeah, there's a bit of a virtual applause. Okay, so if I suggest that if you have questions, the easiest, if you just let me know by putting down your name in the group chat, just say that you have a question. You can also use the raise hand function if you want to. But that's sometimes a bit more difficult to spot. Whilst everyone is sort of thinking and gathering their thoughts, let me start with a question or sort of more of a comment or kind of like express my bafflement. I was so fascinated that they use such a positive term or positive idea of civilization, and especially, I don't know, someone who works on the sort of interwar, German interwar period, civilization is kind of always seen in such negative terms. It was always seen as something that has such a dark underbelly. And I was wondering, I mean, would it be correct to say that they have a very, very positive view of this kind of European civilization? What about then imperialism, colonialism, slavery, even the tensions in Europe within class struggles? So how do we accommodate that? Do they ever comment on this? Is this something that is on their mind, or?
Okay, very, very large question to unpack here. Civilization, I guess, is very much like, you can see it, it's in the titles, it's everywhere, like it's used completely unproblematically. That's just the term that is around there. And I think that's a very standard sort of 19th century kind of context where you have these civilizational histories. And I think the worry is a lot more about, and I've briefly addressed this, about the possibility of a decline of civilization. So you have sort of a slight Fin-de-Siècle angst coming up, but it's definitely not that this would be a reason to question the concept of civilization itself. And I think for anarchists, maybe part of the reason why they're so keen to really insist on this is because they always find themselves confronted with this idea of being sort of these backward, want to retreat to the woods kind of naive people who don't share in this sort of modern civilized society. And I think it's something that we also see in like how they talk about technology and so forth, it's clearly something that there is a tiny hint, and we can talk about the environmental aspect, that will be another huge topic at a later point maybe, but it's clearly like there is some hint of, yes, environmental destruction is a problem, but generally speaking, it's always this idea of human genius and sort of, yeah, promoting this. Now, when it comes to imperialism, the case is much more complicated, and there is quite a bit of literature on that, because sort of like there is a lot of literature which has really argued, and not without reason, and by showing a lot of examples, and especially by sort of placing Reclus in this larger 19th century context, that his stance was often very critical, especially when it came to violence, exploitation, and that he was very aware of some of the problems, especially like for someone in the late 19th century. However, I don't think that this completely like frees the anarchists from any association with imperialist projects. So for example, Ferretti makes this distinction between him sort of being critical, being okay with settler colonialism. His daughter moves to Algeria and he himself goes there several times, and sort of with settler colonialism, in a way, he's much more at ease if it is about sort of bringing this civilization and connecting different civilizations together. So if colonialism is a vessel of, he's sometimes sort of quite overlooking its violent aspects, but he clearly rejects the sort of outright conquest type of exploitation of raw materials kind of colonialism. But it is a bit, and it's there is a lot of literature that's also like very politically charged in many ways on the topic. So I would go with something like, yeah, by 19th century standards, he's doing quite okay, but yeah.
I think this idea of almost having it as a strategy as well to be heard is quite interesting.
Yeah.
We do have a few questions coming in, so I'll just like, I'll take them one by one for now, and we'll see how we go along. So Tanya Shoes next.
Thanks so much for that, Pascal. That was so interesting and beautifully presented. I loved it. First, I'd really like it if you could speak more about those Russian connections you mentioned. But related to that, if most of your protagonists are sharing the same space, would you say that global history is your intellectual subject matter, but in this chapter, you're not necessarily employing a global history methodology yourself? Is that something you explore in the book, or would you just disagree with that characterization?
Okay, well, thank you so much. These are both excellent questions. Yeah, the Russian connections. So when we look at this network, like a lot of people have observed, okay, they're all somehow interested in geography. They're all somehow interested in anarchism, or like there's some figures, like there's also like some marginal figures that share one of these aspects to a larger extent than to another. For example, Reclus and Kropotkin both correspond with Patrick Geddes, who never officially calls himself an anarchist, but is clearly sort of in these larger socialist circles and so forth. But one of the things that we also see is that there are a lot of Russians, or even people like Perron, Reclus' cartographer, trained in Russia. Reclus' brother Elie Wright is a correspondent for a Russian journal. So, I mean, on the one hand, you don't want to go too far in a sort of essentialist, oh, this is the wild Russianness of these people direction. But then I think that some of this does inform the sort of larger conception of space and geography that they have. And I think that's also a point that we really see with Plekhanov and Russian Marxism, that it's precisely the Russian Marxists who are a lot more open to this idea already in the 19th century of taking spatial categories, thinking about environmental determinism and these issues, because, and I think as a way of sort of relating this to the question of, is this a global history? I guess the Russianness of these historical figures is also often presented as a kind of intermediary between the West and the sort of non-West, because Russia always has this peripheral position that, for example, Mechnikov, when he's in Europe, he frames himself sort of as a Westerner, but clearly he has, by virtue of sort of this proximity, he has a different access to Japanese culture, say, than a French person would have. And he uses this sort of intermediate position in quite a conscious way. So yeah, I mean, a global history sort of, I mean, I guess that's the problem with sort of hype terms, that you can, of course, make a case for. So if we think about the question of, I don't know if you remembered the volume by Sam Moyne and Andrew Sartori on global intellectual history. And in the introduction, they say there's sort of 3 ways of doing global intellectual history. We can sort of do an intellectual history that's more inclusive of non-Western, that sort of challenges the canon. We can do, and you could do that with my project to some extent, in that you could say, okay, we have these Russian people in there, but then at the same time, like, I want to be very careful to point out that there are some exchanges with non-Westerners, but they tend to be like a very small part of the correspondence of these people. And sometimes it's also like, it doesn't seem like an exchange that's completely happening on equal footing. So, I mean, when the example that I gave you with the 2 different maps, I think we see here sort of, this is the sort of surprisingly good native conception. And then here we have the real modern scientific conception. So you always have this sense of a hierarchy. And then the second way in which we could call this a global intellectual history, if you say, okay, I'm looking at a topic of intellectual history that's sort of transnational in its framing, because it brings together different intellectual traditions. And I think that's sort of pretty much what I'm doing, because yeah, it's people living in Switzerland from France, from Russia, and I think it's a lot of, and then in other chapters we also have like sort of a British influence with the whole debate around Darwinism and so forth. So you really have, I think, what these people do a lot of the times is incredibly original, but it's the sort of putting it together and how they put it together and how they sort of politically charge it that's original. So, but would you call it global? I guess sort of transnational or transcultural would be more appropriate. And then the final definition that they suggest, and that's the one that I'm probably most happy to live with, is sort of, we can look at past conceptions of the global and sort of historicize how people thought about global connections and try to make sense of the world. And I think that's also sort of my point in this talk, to say that, yeah, we have these people who really think about world history, not necessarily in a sort of Hegelian top-down way, but they start from the ground, they do this bottom-up kind of, that modern global historians try to arrive at. And I guess my sort of little stab there was also at the, yeah, but we still a lot of the times end up with something that's fairly Eurocentric. And yeah, it's difficult, sort of the more global you go, some of these problems are just, even if you sort of change your approach to it, they're bound to come up time and again.
Thank you. The next question is by Georgios Varoufakis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Georgios.
Hi, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. I have a question, which is, you mentioned at some point the theory that the modern civilization that they were talking about was not in danger of barbarization and collapsing the way the ancient civilizations were, and so on. I have there are various versions of that idea, all the way from Gibbon onwards, and I'm sure before Gibbon. And one of the things that always struck me is that the idea is, because they are several and there is competition between them and even struggle, that's why they are vital and that's why they're progressive and so on. I wonder what exactly was the world order envisaged in detail by your anarchists, A, if there was one, and B, if there were differences between them. So were they thinking in terms of competing great powers which somehow balance each other? Were they thinking of a federation? That's where my question is driving at. This is not part of the question, but since you mentioned Geddes, since I raised my hand, Geddes was a positivist, a contist. So it's a very interesting connection that he was associated with them. Thanks.
Okay, well, wonderful questions. And yeah, I guess, yeah, you're pointing to something that's incredibly obvious, and that maybe because I've been reading too much anarchists, I've completely failed to point out. That yes, it's obviously a big difference that when they think about the world coming together, the world being unified, in their view, it's always about establishing equilibrium. It's about harmony. It's not so much about a sort of conflictive view between civilization. And I think that's also the point when they say we will at some point all be one large civilization, and this civilization will no longer be able to collapse because it's going to be all of us, because we're all going to be, so this is why this sort of global civilization that they see coming seems a lot more stable than potentially conflictual civilizations. Now, this is not to say that they're completely, that there's no notion of competition, because what's interesting, what I found in my sources a lot, is that they're really in touch with the people who, I mean, it's not called geopolitics in the 19th century, but they read all the authors who would later become the forefathers of geopolitics. So Halford Mackinder plans to publish a volume in which Reclus edits one series and Kropotkin another one. And I find that quite striking. And Ratzel, for example, I mentioned him briefly, Reclus is pretty much on board with a lot of what he says. So there is this idea, I think, precisely because space has this incredible power attached to it. So it's obviously not completely devoid of the potential of conflict. For example, these encounters at some point Reclus calls like sort of and that's a very similar idea to Mackinder's pivot, that the center of Asia will become like the battleground where the future of history will be fought over. But then at the same time, he says, we can just do the same thing as we did with the Alps. One day we'll surpass the Himalayas and we'll all come together. And so I think, and it's especially this language of an equilibrium emerging from conflict. So Reclus has these three historical laws, one of them being like the law of class conflict, but then the final law is always that of the quest for the equilibrium. So there is this idea of a balance, and maybe sometimes even, and I think that's also like, that ties into sort of Kropotkin's reading of Darwin, which is also to say that, yes, there is competition, but it's not nearly as important as we think it is. It's all about collaboration, and that this sociology is based on association brings me to your other question about Kant, because what's really interesting in how Metchnikov frames his sort of historical sociological thesis is that he says, Kant was completely right about association being the law of society. So they're all like, in many ways, readers of Kant, and also the Milieu concept and everything. So that's definitely something that's there and very present. It's not so often like acknowledged and cited. So I don't think we have a lot of instances where, like with the Michelet quote, where sort of Reclus will go like, and this is as Kant says. I mean, this Metchnikov article is probably a bit unusual in this context, and that it explicitly says, yeah, I'm taking Kant's law, but I'm sort of applying it to all kinds of association. So I think he says Kant's mistake is to limit this to society, but this law sort of works for cells and all kinds of organisms, because association is just, next to competition in a sort of Spencerian or Darwinian sense, is one of the laws of nature. And I think naturally they'd be more inclined towards this more cooperative view of the world.
Thanks. So we have the next question from Danny Evans. And I encourage you, if you do have questions, to put them to raise your hand now. Yes, Danny, do go ahead.
Thanks very much, Pascal. I can't wait to read the book. It's so interesting. So my question, I suppose, is about how kind of representative of anarchist thought the thinkers you focus on are. So I think that the sense that anarchists have a kind of investment in the categories of modernity and civilization, and also want to assert that anarchism is embedded within those categories, right? That it claims, sort of claims a place within this kind of story of civilization. I think it's established, but I mean, I think so we can sort of see the political consequences of that as well, right? And things like the Manifesto of the 16. I think this kind of idea of like association of anarchism as like being tied in with the destiny of civilization more broadly is like provides ideological ballast for that kind of position, and also perhaps to an extent, well, I think to for the anarchist collaboration with the Republican state during the Spanish Civil War and things like that as well. But what I kind of wonder is like is there a kind of counter sort of tendency to that within anarchism, especially because you're writing at you're focusing on the period where anarchism becomes a kind of mass movement, where it's involving people who who aren't intellectuals and who are clearly excluded from civilization, and in a way that possibly like people like Kropotkin and Reclus are not. So I suppose what I'm asking is this what you're talking about, this like intellectual like worldview you're talking about, is that anarchism? Is that what anarchism thinks at this time? Or is it like, do we need to sort of bear in mind like who these people are in dialogue with, and like what their own sorts of like milieu is as intellectuals and not just as anarchists?
Okay, thank you so much. I guess you're pointing the finger here at something very crucial. I mean, of course, I said in the introduction that I do intend this as a provocation in the sense that I very deliberately stress these aspects that we know less about, I think, and that we don't normally associate with anarchist thought. There is obviously like, it would be, and I think part of the problem stems from the fact that I'm focusing here really on the sort of intellectual idea, on the intellectual history of anarchism rather than the movement. And I think when we look at the movement, it would be quite different. And it would also, and I think that the movement will eventually feed back. And I guess that's perhaps most clearly visible when we look at this sort of question of anarchist communities. So Kropotkin really clearly writes, we can't isolate ourselves from society. We can't just retreat to a mountaintop and have our perfect anarchist commune and live happily ever after. We have to sort of stay in society and so forth. It doesn't stop activists from writing to him in the newspapers, oh, we want to found a commune, what should we do about it? Like clearly there is some kind of mismatch between this and between sort of how they relate to the movement and this tendency. And there is, I think it's also, a lot of it is, I guess also an issue of chronology, that I think this kind of thinking is very prominent in these sort of late 19th, in these final decades of the 19th century. And then like after the whole conflicts around World War I and so forth, I think anarchism pretty aggressively like changes directions in many ways. And I think sort of a lot of I think Kropotkin a lot of the times it's just like becomes like this figurehead and this sort of, oh yeah, that's our great tradition, because there's also like, there is a lot in a philosophy that's so open about its sort of spontaneity, it's being able to incorporate very contradictory elements. It's very difficult to build a consistent narrative or sort of, and so it's a lot about canon building. And it's also like what Reclus and Kropotkin do by sort of putting together people like Stirner, Bakunin, and just saying, oh yeah, we're all part of this great tradition that for Kropotkin even goes back to Lao Tse and so forth. And I think that their continuity a lot of the times isn't so much in what's actually being read. I mean, there are texts like then people will read the bits that sort of especially resonate with them. And that's also like selectiveness is a problem in the sense that Reclus published 30,000 pages. So you can find a lot in there if you want to find it. And no one ever said that it's free from contradiction. So I think it's a lot about our own lens in looking at these thinkers. The point where they get most sort of pushback within anarchism is this question that I discussed in another section of, should we really like attach all this power to science, and is science really going to solve us? And that's where you get sort of Malatesta and other people going like, no, this is not, we can't have like such a deterministic vision, and we need to be more invested in other things as well. But I've not really come across like a massive pushback from other anarchists saying, what is this global stuff you're doing there? And we're not interested in civilization. Well, I'd be really interested in seeing such critiques. And I think they sometimes come up a bit later. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that I'm unfortunately not able to do, but that thankfully other great scholars, some of which who are here today, I see, have done is, for example, look at Reclus' reception in Japan and then see like, or in other places, like, I think that's probably, it would be outside of Europe where you will get most of the contestation of these things. But yeah, does that answer your question? A bit all over the place.
Thank you. So I've got 2 more questions on my list, and we're still slowly running out of time, but I think as it's such an interesting topic, I think we'll just stick with it and keep going. But maybe if you try and keep your questions short. So the next one on my list is John Eric Hanson.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk. 2 questions, hopefully they're short. One, actually, you mentioned, which is the question of the reception of Reclus and the reception outside of Europe. So I was wondering, whether there was some pushback, or whether, how were his ideas, taken on, or were they taken on, or not at all outside of Europe? Again, if you can't answer this because that's just outside of the scope, that's totally fine. The second, I was intrigued by the process of creating global consciousness that you kind of hinted at during the presentation, and I thought it would be really cool to get some more out of that now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, like I said, I would really love to know more about what's happening outside of Europe, and thankfully that work has been done and is being done. So we can get that at least for some places. Maybe just on the European reception very briefly. So Reclus is very largely forgotten. And what I find the most striking aspect of this reception history is that the Marxists of the spatial turn, sort of in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's virtually no reception of these anarchists and geographers. That's sort of the absence that I really find most striking. And even like Henri Lefebvre, for example, he reads like Reclus' book on the Pyrenees and uses these illustrations, but he doesn't see him as an inventor of social space or anything. That's only like Christine Ross who comes up with that reading a bit later. So it's really interesting that this whole like spatial dimension collapses. And I think it's because a lot of it just feels so outdated, like this whole civilization progress, this very positivistic science will change the world stance that's just in the 20th century not really appealing to people anymore. And I think it's only now that we get a bit more of this, probably in a global history context, to come back to an earlier question, that we're sort of interested in these figures and probably also because the sort of Marxist position in geography, at least within the field of geography, it's more and more contested by these post-colonial and so forth stances that I think that's also where some of it comes in, and that explains the sort of reclus renaissance that we've seen in the last 10 years. Now, thank you for asking me about global consciousness, because this is the most fun part of the project. This is where I get to talk about the idea of building a 160 diameter globe for the Paris World Exhibition and these sort of things. This is Patrick Geddes' Outlook Tower is precisely so. There are these educational projects, and in a sense, the Nouvelle Géographie Universelle itself is seen as such a project of, it's not explicitly political. I did a sort of keyword search, and I think the term anarchist appears twice in sort of the anarchic leanings or something like that. So it's not, but it's still aimed at this sort of, the idea is that if we know about the world, we will be, and it appears in weekly installments that are really cheap to buy. It's advertised in the workers' press and so forth. So it's clearly aimed at a larger audience. And I think that, yeah, so it comes with a pedagogical process. And I think here the geography as well is important, because there's a lot of literature at the time that's really about how geography is sort of as an especially sort of propedeutic pedagogical science that really helps people to then get on and move on to the sort of more complex sciences. So there's clearly like this educational mission here that also ties in with cosmopolitanism, obviously, which in a lot of its understandings has this sort of educational thrust to it. So the idea is really that if we will feel as one humanity, which we can through such geographical knowledge, we will end up being freer, I guess.
Thank you. And for now, the last question, I think, is from Bruno Leipold.
Hi, Pascal. Thanks.
Hi,
I enjoyed that a lot. I was very pleased to see Domela Nieuwenhuis make an appearance, who I only know as a recipient of a letter from Marx where he criticizes utopian socialism. It's nice to hear him suddenly pop up again. Was I right? That was the letter that that's the letter that he gets from Kropotkin where he draws this little graph, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I really like that that little graph. Maybe I didn't hear it. What is the axis that he's referring to, and perhaps related to that, why is 1848 not on there when all the other revolutionary blips?
Okay, should I? Maybe I should put up the graph again, right? Just so that we can have. Let me just find the graph again. 1 second. Where do we have it? Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I think I'm gonna, there we go. Here it is. Yes, so it was one of the archival finds, and it's even, there are 2 graphs. So Domela Nieuwenhuis, and this is just, I think it tells us so much about how Kropotkin thinks, because so he has this anarchist that writes to him, oh, the movement's in disarray, nothing's happening, it's all terrible, I don't feel it's going anywhere. And then Kropotkin draws 2 different graphs to tell him, look what happened a century ago, it's all going to be fine. The other graph is a sort of power diagram where you can see sort of different political currents pulling in different directions, and him sort of, an anarchist being able to inflect the arrow sort of slightly to the left, sort of, it's all about, so what I think is interesting about this graph is that all while sort of being about the revolution, it's really a defense of gradual progress as well, because I think that's something that we often get, or a question that I sometimes get when I talk about these anarchist geographers, that sort of, yeah, building a global consciousness and everything, it's nice, but it's not really how we imagine the revolution to look like. And I think, so there are so many things that are interesting about this graph, like also that he's clearly had to correct it. But the basic idea is that, So we have a horizontal, that's just like sort of time, I guess. Then we have progress as a curve. So it says long progress, so slow progress. And then it sort of slowly goes up. And from 1790 on, and this is what he describes in the letter, he says, okay, that's when the anarchists started militating. That's when they started sort of acting upon the course of history. And this is what actually happened. So they really managed to push things in the right direction. Then unfortunately there was this backlash, but because of all the previous work that they'd done, they were able to continue. And then the dotted line is, this is what would have happened if it weren't for the anarchists. And I think there's different things that are interesting, like that the dotted line also goes up. So there seems to be like just some kind of natural progress slowly occurring regardless of what. And yeah, 48, where is 48? Excellent question. Maybe it should cut off earlier, but yeah, it doesn't. And yeah, but I just thought it was a good illustration of sort of this real commitment to a notion of having to act upon the historical course, because he says like, this is what happens when we act and this is what happens when we don't act. So against this sort of deterministic idea.
No, thanks, Pascal. It's a great find, that graph.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it also reminds us of the good old times when we could all go to the archive. And hopefully we can go soon again and find these things. So as I said, we're sort of slowly running out of time, but if there is one final question, do speak now. But I think we've sort of taxed Pascal quite a bit. And we've had
2 hours. I only realized this morning that it wasn't 1.5, but 2 hours.
And it was a lovely paper, and I think it was a great advertisement for the book as well. And I think we're all really excited for it now. As